Okay, thanks everybody. I thought I'd try speaking without the microphone first. Is that still okay? Yeah. Right up the back in here, up right? Not quite? Okay. Okay, I'll revert to the mic then. So welcome to another episode of God and Beer for May. God and Beer is an initiative of the Knights of the Southern Cross Dandenong North Branch, and my name's John Smythe. Welcome everybody. I thought we'd begin with a quick Hail Mary. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace. Blessed art thou amongst women, blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So, as I was saying, welcome to the next episode of God and Beer. Our talk tonight is it's a difficult topic. It's a challenging topic. I remember at the time when Cardinal Pell was first charged, feeling some kind of trauma as a result of that. It felt a little bit like the Catholic Church itself was under attack, and Catholics were a little bit under attack because right from the beginning it just seemed like something wasn't quite right about it. I know every Catholic, everybody in this room, I'm sure, thinking back to all the scandals around sexual abuse and the cover-ups that occurred around that have been revealed over the last few years, we all felt outraged and we wanted to see justice done. But this didn't seem right somehow. And as the details came to light and it became clear that there was definitely something fishy about it, it was kind of a wound for a lot of Catholics, I think. And of course, him being found guilty, having his reputation destroyed, it was a difficult time in many ways. And then when he was eventually found innocent by the High Court, COVID just came along at that very moment, and so the whole episode, the whole saga of Pell being found guilty, then being found innocent, it kind of got brushed a little bit to the side, and I don't think it got addressed in possibly the way that it needed to be. So when I was thinking for topics for God and Beer, I thought back to that episode, and I feel like there's still a lot that needs to be said. In particular, how did it happen? How was it that he was charged and found guilty when it was, in many ways, it seemed clear that it wasn't the case. So that's why we've asked Father Frank Brennan, SJ, to come along tonight. He's one of Australia's preeminent human rights lawyers and Catholic public intellectuals. His whole life he's been an advocate for the poor and the disadvantaged, especially Indigenous Australians and refugees. And he followed this case as closely as anybody. Attended all of the proceedings at each of the stages, I believe. And given his legal background and the fact that he's written a book about the case, I thought there's probably no one better to talk about this topic for us. So if you can join me in welcoming Father Frank Brennan, please.
Good evening, everyone, and great to be with you, even though we're talking about a very difficult topic. I'm delighted to have accepted the invitation of John to come and speak here this evening, because you'll recall that the plight of Cardinal Pell first came to public attention with his conviction and the lifting of the suppression order in February 2019. And he was ultimately completely acquitted by the High Court in April 2020. I, being a Catholic priest, have been wary about giving too many talks about this topic, because I know the hurt that can be done, not only to victims but to bona fide complainants in relation to these sorts of matters. So I've given only 2 talks in Sydney and 1 in Canberra. I accepted this invitation because this is the first time I've ever been invited to speak in Victoria about this matter. And I, originally being a Queenslander, but now resident in Victoria, want to make a very strong point to you as a Victorian audience tonight. And I'm going to be pretty bold in saying a few things. I don't think any police force in Australia except Vic Pell would have got up to this sort of caper. I don't think any Director of Public Prosecutions in Australia except the Victorian DPP would get up to this sort of caper. And I don't think any ultimate state appeal court in Australia except the Victorian Court of Appeal would have made the decision that it did. So there are things in Victoria which are not right, and they've got lots of things to do not just with one Cardinal George Pell. But I then want to zero in and to look particularly at the case to highlight to you what an absolute farce it was from go to woe. So I'll speak for about half an hour or so, but then allow lots of time for questions and discussion. And please don't be afraid to disagree with me. And if there be anyone at the end of the night, not who has evidence, but who has even a theory as to how the offences could have occurred, I for one would love to hear it. Just to set the context, I was appointed by Malcolm Turnbull to the Ruddock Review on Religious Freedom a few years ago. And one day when I was doing that inquiry and moving around the country, I got a phone call from one of Australia's leading journalists. He's a Pell hater, like a number of them, but he wanted to talk to me about religious freedom. And at the end of the conversation he said to me, "What do you think will happen in the Pell case in the High Court?" I said to him, "You know enough about the law to know that anyone who confidently predicts that Pell will be given special leave to appeal is a fool, because no one can accurately predict when the High Court decides in its absolute discretion to give special leave in a High Court case." But I said, I think they will give special leave, and I make this prediction. If they do, then they will decide in his favour 5-zip or 7-zip, depending if all 7 sit. He said, "Really?" He said, "How could you say that?" I said, "Because I know there is no one on the High Court of Australia, including the 2 Victorians who are there, who would write the sort of nonsense written by Justice Maxwell and signed off by Chief Justice Ferguson." He said, "If that happens, I'll owe you a very good meal." I said, "Indeed you will." And 2 minutes after the High Court gave its decision, I contacted him and said, "You owe me that meal." And I am yet to enjoy it. So, that's to set the context. How did I get involved? And I think it's important for people like yourselves to understand. Some of you would know that, to put it mildly, in the past, Cardinal Pell and I had quarrelled. We didn't see eye to eye on quite a number of issues, and we had public disagreements about a number of things, which I needn't go into this evening. Things had reached a low point for me when someone had written a very colourful biography of one of Australia's great judicial figures, Roddy Marr, on the Court of Appeal in New South Wales. Roddy had the misfortune to have been educated by the Jesuits at St Ignatius College, Riverview. And he'd been interviewed for the biography, and he'd said that he thought the Jesuits had changed, and that now the preeminent Jesuit seemed to be Father Frank Brennan, who was short on Greek verbs and long on witchetty grubs because of the work that I did with Aboriginal Australians. So I thought that was quite humorous, but Cardinal Pell had been interviewed for the biography as well, and he took up this theme and he said that he thought the problem with Brennan was that he wasn't really theologically educated, and that the Jesuits had basically replaced Jesus Christ with social justice. Well, I was getting of an age where I wrote to him and I said, look, I think this time you need to apologise. Well, I got a very strong letter back from him. So, fast forward, in 2014, when the Royal Commission was getting underway, and you might remember when he first appeared before the Royal Commission, there were questions about the defence in the so-called Ellis case. And I thought that he could have handled things slightly differently. So I got up early one morning and I wrote to him. I said, look, I know you think I'm a piece of work, but I'd like to offer some gratuitous advice. Well, basically he accepted that advice and he followed it. And I thought, well, that's a good thing. So later, when this caravan got moving in Victoria, I contacted him once again. I had had the good fortune years ago, as they say, to read at the Melbourne Bar. That is, to spend a year at the Melbourne Bar becoming a barrister. And I read with a very fine barrister who later became a judge, John Hassett, who is since deceased. And so I wrote to Cardinal Pell and I said, look, particularly if there are going to be suppression orders in place with what's about to go on, I think you should get someone like a retired county court judge who can sit in the proceedings, and then when the suppression orders are lifted, then you'll be in a position to have that retired county court judge give the public an accurate account of what has occurred. And that is at least owed to the Catholics in the community to understand what has happened. Well, after some weeks, he came to me, we had lunch together in Sydney, and he said to me in his inimitable form, he said, I've spoken to my people, whoever they are, and we've decided better to have you rather than the retired county court judge, because you go over better with the literati and the glitterati. Well, I thought, it's not for me, even as a Jesuit, just to do this off my own bat. So an arrangement was entered into, an agreement, where the Jesuit Provincial agreed with the President of the Catholic Bishops' Conference, Archbishop Coleridge, and the Vice President of the Bishops' Conference, Archbishop Fisher, that I would be available to attend the proceedings and then, when suppression orders were lifted, to give an accurate assessment of things. And Cardinal Pell, for his part, agreed that I would have access to all publicly available transcripts, which meant the transcript except that of the complainant giving his evidence at the time. But you will appreciate, in proceedings of this sort, the key evidence given by the complainant gets repeated by the lawyers in putting it to other witnesses, or putting it in their final addresses, or being put by the judge in his final summing up to the jury. So I think I had a fair sense of all of that. One of the, there were three people who wrote about it at the time, all of whom, of course, predicted the result, that Pell had to be slotted. And one of them, actually, she got very upset. How dare Father Brennan be saying these things when she'd been working very hard and it was taking her weeks to finally get hold of the transcript. So what would Father Brennan know? Well, Father Brennan by that stage had had the transcript for about 3 months, and I'd been through it with a tooth comb. So what we then had was the situation that I was there positioned to attend proceedings and then, with access to the transcript, to make an assessment of the matter. So, what was the history as to what VicPol were up to? What you've got to appreciate here in Victoria is there'd been a very sad and sorry history with child sexual abuse within institutions, particularly in the Diocese of Ballarat and here in the Archdiocese of Melbourne. And there were two institutions at fault. One was the Catholic Church, The other, surprise, surprise, was Victoria Police. Now, Victoria Police, good luck to them, decided that attack was the best form of defence. There was then an inquiry set up, a Victorian parliamentary inquiry, and what you have to remember is that there'd been a situation when Archbishop Pell had become the Archbishop of Melbourne. Immediately he had been told by people like Premier Kennett and Governor McGarvey that there are things that need to be cleaned up and you need to do something about it. Pell did what he always does. He went to the top end of town, said don't care how much it costs, let's get a scheme set up, which became the Melbourne response. Signed off on by the Victorian Solicitor General. Every step of the way for 15 years, agreement with Victoria Police as to how to proceed. Now, in the light of the Royal Commission, we can all agree things could have been done better. But back in those days, this was new territory, and the Church was cooperating closely with Victoria Police. Once the Victorian Parliamentary Committee was established, Victoria Police, quite improperly and unfairly, tried to distance themselves from the Melbourne response, saying that they'd long been critical of it. Nothing could be further from the truth, and the Parliamentary Committee unanimously stated that. And what we had was a situation thereafter where Victoria Police were being less than candid in terms of the dealings with the Catholic Church on this issue. It was also known that Commissioner Ashton and Cardinal Pell, they were like two bulls in the paddock. There was no love lost there. And you had a situation in 2013 where Victoria Police set up an operation called Operation Tethering. And Operation Tethering was to try to inquire into any wrongdoing that may have been committed by citizen George Pell. It, completely unheard of that something like this would be established. Suffice to say, it didn't really come up with very much. What you had then in the middle of 2015 was the complainant in these proceedings came forward and he made a statement. And he said that he and his friend, who was now deceased, that they were members of the choir and that they had been sexually assaulted in the most appalling fashion by Cardinal Pell straight after Mass in the priest's sacristy after the 11 a.m. solemn Mass. So that was the statement that he put in June 2015. You'd think you'd get to work on that, wouldn't you, if you'd had Operation Tethering running since 2013. Strangely, nothing very much happened. But then on Christmas Eve 2015, and the Age cooperated fully, front page of the Age on Christmas Eve, big banner photo of St Patrick's Cathedral, that here was Vic Pol investigating any wrongdoing committed by Pell in St Patrick's Cathedral during the years when he was the Archbishop. Now you say to yourself, you've got this complaint from June 2015 and you place this advertisement, as it was, on the front page of the Age on Christmas Eve 2015. What's that about? Presumably they thought to themselves, well, if this fella's complained, there must be a lot of others also who were similarly abused by Pell. The only other alternative is to think that they thought to themselves, well, we've got this complaint from this fella, but it doesn't really stack up. We need to try and get something else. Now, it had to be one or other of those things. Well, in March 2016, they then finally decide to call the complainant in to do a walk through the cathedral. So I think we can fairly assume by March 2016 they thought, despite the trawling exercise with Operation Tethering, despite the trawling exercise on Christmas Eve 2015, all they had to go with was this complaint. So they bring him in. and he walks them through the cathedral to tell them the dreadful things that were done to him and his mate immediately after a solemn mass at 11 a.m. on a Sunday, and to say that a second assault occurred about a month later just on him in the corridor outside the sacristy as everyone was processing back after the mass. And he was quite clear in that walkthrough in stipulating that the way it worked at the end of mass, if you can see the sanctuary there in the middle as the grey area, and so you've got the main nave here down to the west door. In his mind, the complainant's mind, at the end of each mass, they would engage in an internal procession, which is 56 steps from the choir stalls round to the priest sacristy. That's the blue line that is there. So that happens in March 2016. Then comes, I think, one of the really nice Victorian touches to this story. They decide, well, let's go and examine Cardinal Pell in Rome. So 3 of them set off. Who sets off? Well, you've got the investigating officer. His name is Chris Reed. As I say, not the sharpest knife in the drawer, but he's been following Cardinal Pell for a long time by now. He's accompanied by 2 others. One is Shane Patton, who was the heir apparent to be commissioner. It would be an internal appointment, of course, ultimately as commissioner, and Shane Patton was to be appointed. Shane was sent over to basically deliver on this exercise. And the other one to accompany Shane Patton was a fellow by the name of Paul Sheridan. Now, at the time, I thought, well, Paul Sheridan presumably is, just a good investigating officer. So they go across, 3 of them, and Shane Patton waits outside while Sheridan and Reed have the examination of Cardinal Pell. Cardinal Pell thought, a bit like Louise Milligan in her book, that, there was some allegation that things had happened in dark rooms at the back of the cathedral after choir practice when no one was around. Well, no, that wasn't it. It was that these dreadful events had occurred straight after solemn high mass at 11 a.m. Well, you can imagine Pell's reaction. He said, well, that's just absolutely preposterous. It's ridiculous. Well, put the emotion of his reaction to one side. Basically, he says to these learned investigating police officers who have flown to the other side of the world, as I say, I don't know, but I presume at least Patton and Sheridan flew business class. Anyway, he puts to them, this is ridiculous. The suggestion that this could have happened in the sacristy immediately after a solemn high mass. He said, the sacristy after 11 a.m. mass is a hive of activity. He said there'd be people everywhere. So there'd be a sacristan, an assistant sacristan, any concelebrants. There'd be altar servers, 7 or 9 of them. There'd be money counters or money collectors who come in and bring in the collection. He said, go back to Melbourne and ask those people. Go and talk to the altar servers. Go and talk to the concelebrants. And furthermore, Pell said, this idea of an internal procession seemed ridiculous. It was pouring rain maybe, but no. We always, other than a tropical downpour, we would do an external procession. And we would come down the central nave, out the west door, up past the south transept, round through a toilet corridor, and then into the priest's sacristy. Sheridan, this is the only key role Sheridan played in the inquiry, said, you sure about that external procession, etc.? I said, yeah, go back and check. So they returned to Melbourne. I should just interpose at this stage why I then became a bit suspicious later about Sheridan was not myself, But Sheridan then got an adverse report from IBAC here about overseeing an operation where there'd been the substitution of witness statements regarding the killing of 2 police officers. And then there was another black mark by the Royal Commission into Lawyer X. You say, well, why was this person handpicked to go to Rome to conduct this operation? Anyway, here we are, we come back, and they don't interview one single altar server. They don't interview one single money collector. They don't interview one single conciliant. Let me just read you at the trial, Robert Rector, who appeared for Pell. He says to Mr. Reid that there were altar servers. By the time we got to the second trial, we'd already come across this altar server by the name of Connor, and he was anally retentive, and he used to keep a book where he recorded every altar server who appeared at every mass. And so it was because of Connor's book that we were able to identify that the main offences alleged to have occurred must have been on either the 15th or the 22nd of December 1996. And so the question then was, well, did you interview any altar servers? That you had Connor's book. Connor's book had the names of altar servers in it, including those who'd had lunches together. Said, you accept that, don't you? Yes, I'll accept that, yes. So what happens is this, says Rector. Apart from the fact that we tracked down Mr. Connor, you'd not tracked down any altar servers at all. No, that's correct. But the altar servers were a very, very important part of this investigation. Well, not during the investigative stage. No, we were concerned with the choir boys specifically, because the events that have been alleged occurred surrounding the choir boys, not the altar servers that were in a different location and had a different role. Sure, they'd been in a different location, namely the location where the offences were alleged to have occurred. But there weren't any choir boys present when this happened, alleged to have happened. Well, says Reid, there weren't any altar servers. Well, you'll appreciate if there are any choir boys present, they'd be miscreants because they'd be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The altar servers would be in the right place at the right time, simply doing what they'd always done. There weren't any of those present. There weren't any altar servers alleged to be present either. Correct, but the altar servers took part in processions in the same way that the choir boys took part in the processions. That's correct, yes. So what we had was a situation where it was decided no need to interview any altar servers. As I say, this type of policing, it's the equivalent, let's step right away from the emotion of child sexual abuse or a complainant making a complaint. Let's just imagine a scene of someone who's a witness to a bank robbery and they're a pedestrian. I'm a pedestrian, I go to the police and I say, I have witnessed a bank robbery at the ANZ Bank on the corner there this afternoon. So the police come in and they say, right. And I say, I didn't see any bank tellers. And they say, right, we won't interview any bank tellers, but we will interview 30 pedestrians. Why? Because the eyewitness said he was a pedestrian. Now, wouldn't you think in a police investigation you would at least want to interview the bank tellers, if only to find out what did you usually do in the bank at that time of day? Similarly, wouldn't you want to interview altar servers to say what would be happening at that time of day? Well, by the time the matter comes on for trial, the complainant realises that the story about the internal procession just doesn't stack up. Because there are so many other witnesses who have been called who say, no, it's an external procession. So he says, no external procession. It says, what we did, we came down the nave, okay? The middle, he says, come down the nave, the green line, and then we come out and we go up near the south transept. But then I and my mate, without talking to each other, we're in the procession, but we just spontaneously decided to peel off from the procession and to enter in the south transept, and surprise, surprise, to resume the route that would have been taken if it were an internal procession. So that's what we did. Now that comes in at 277 steps, okay? Then gets to trial, even that story falls apart. Why? Because the boys are at the front of the procession. At the back of the procession, of course, are the adult choristers, some of whom are the fathers of some of the boys in the front. And the idea that they could have peeled off at the south transept while they're still processing out in a public place seemed to be not very likely. So he said, oh no, that's right. What we did, we kept with the procession, we came right around into the toilet corridor, and then in the narrow toilet corridor, we then decided spontaneously to turn around, go back against the flow of the procession, then through the south transept and up to the priest sacristy. That's 408 steps. All you've got to remember is those 408 steps take 5.5 minutes, okay? 5.5 minutes. By the time the case came to the jury the second time round, the Crown case had come down to this idea that yes, there was 6 minutes of offending that occurred in the sacristy, and that this occurred after the beginning of the private prayer time, which the sacristan said he would allow when the congregation had set out from the foot of the sanctuary. Okay? So the lead altar server sets out from the foot of the sanctuary and the private prayer time commences, right? The clock commences. Well, by the time Jay and his mate reach the priest sacristy, it will be at least 5.5 minutes, plus the time they took to fossick around, plus the time it took for someone further back in the procession than that of the person at the front of the procession. The 6 minutes has evaporated. The Crown had to try and find those 6 minutes. The giveaway to me that the case could not be sustained was it happened that the prosecutor, the chief prosecutor, Mark Gibson, he had been the associate to my old master, Judge Hassett. And one day, and he told me this one day during an adjournment. And I remember going into Cardinal Pell's waiting room, and I, a little irreverently, said to him, well, George, there is a God. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, the prosecutor, I said, he was trained by John Hassett, as was I. He'll be an honourable man. He'll do the right thing. The good thing, Pell said, well, we'll see about that. But the good thing for me was I was then able to sit there thereafter trying to put myself in Gibson's shoes, trying to find the 6 minutes. Well, the giveaway that they couldn't be found was twofold. First, Gibson at the first trial said to Monsignor Portelli, who was the MC, you're a smoker, aren't you? He said, and it's a long proceeding, this solemn high mass. Yeah. Could it be that, as you come out, you just sneak off outside, fully vested, and have a cigarette? Portelli said, no, that's ridiculous. No way, no. Anyway, in the first trial, Gibson, in his final address, said to the jury, maybe this happened. and he had to retract it before the jury. God help us. At the second trial, he did the same thing. This is a QC. You could see how desperate he was to try and get Pell separated from Portelli and to try and find the 6 minutes when Pell could be alone with these authors. But then came the ultimate giveaway. It was, all right, if you accept the final account given by the complainant that they went 408 steps, you'll appreciate that because they came into the toilet corridor and then turned back, the altar servers at the front of the procession would have already reached the priest's sacristy. They'd already be there, wouldn't they? They had to have got there at least a minute beforehand. And they would start ferrying things from the sanctuary to the priest's sacristy backwards and forwards. The hive of activity would have commenced. So it was suggested that, oh no, what happened? The altar servers came into the priest's sacristy and then they adjourned elsewhere for 5 or 6 minutes until they were told by the sacristan they could commence their duties, and that in fact they adjourned to the utility room there. Ruth Shan, the junior for Pell, got up and said, Your Honour, maybe we've missed something, but there's absolutely no evidence from anyone that they adjourned to the utility room. And so Gibson had to retract that before the jury, and having retracted it, he said to them, so we don't know where they went for those 6 minutes. All we know is the evidence of the complainant that they weren't where they should have been. So they were somewhat angelic. If you want to know just how rump a show it became by the time it got to the High Court, the DPP herself, Kerry Judd, appeared before the High Court with Gibson sitting beside her, and she repeated this idea that they adjourned to the utility room. Justice Virginia Bell, the most able criminal lawyer on the court at that time, says, isn't this like repeating what was put by Gibson that had to be retracted? She said, oh yes, but that was far too generous a concession by the prosecutor. You can watch the video, don't believe me, watch the video of the High Court proceedings, because appearing for Pell in the High Court was Brett Walker, one of the best barristers in the country, in the Sydney Bar. I mean, you want to know how good he is? I was in Canberra during the week with an American Jesuit who was a lawyer. So I said to him, come along to the High Court, just watch an hour of argument. There was a case, Google was being sued for defamation. Who did Google brief? Brett Walker. Now, just if you have a chance, go and look at the web and look at Brett Walker's reply after Kerry Judd has strutted her stuff. And he gets up before the 7 judges of the High Court, and you could see this Sydney barrister sort of thinking to himself, what has happened in Victoria? But the DPP herself, he basically said, look, she's not only invented theories, she's invented evidence. And we are expected to answer this sort of stuff when there's absolutely no evidence of this at all. It's just the Crown appearing before the highest court in the land to say that this is a possibility. So what you had was the 6 minutes had disappeared. After he's convicted, it goes to the Victorian Court of Appeal. Justice Maxwell and Chief Justice Ferguson, they basically, the key to their judgment is just a sentence or two. Let me quote it to you. In our view, taking the evidence as a whole, it was open to the jury to find that the assaults took place in 5 to 6 minutes of private prayer time, and that this was before the hive of activity described by the other witnesses began. The jury were not bound to have a reasonable doubt. That's what they thought. The 2 most senior judges of Victoria. I've shown you. Where were the 6 minutes? Let's break it down. The 6 minutes have to occur either before the lead altar servers come in and bow to the crucifix in the priest sacristy, or after the 6 minutes. I do concede to Justice Ferguson and Maxwell, theoretically there would be a possibility the 6 minutes would run over and include the time when the altar servers are in the sacristy bowing to the crucifix. But the idea that the Cardinal could be having his way sexually with 2 boys while the altar servers come in and bow to the crucifix is just absolutely ludicrous. So it has to be either before or after. But as we've seen before, not even Jay and his mate have got there. They're still in procession. And Pell is out here on the front steps with Portelli. So it can't be before. And the suggestion that it's after was, of course, Kerry Judd's invented suggestion that all the altar servers adjourned to the utility room for 6 minutes so that it could happen. No evidence of that whatever. And the 2 altar servers who did give evidence said, no way. We come in, we bow, and we start doing our job. Just to quote the 7 High Court judges, it remains that the evidence of witnesses whose honesty was not in question, so there were 23 other witnesses whose honesty was not in question. 1, placed Pell on the steps of the cathedral for at least 10 minutes after Mass on the 15th and 22nd of December. 2, placed him in the company of Portelli when he returned to the priest sacristy to remove his vestments. And 3, described continuous traffic into and out of the priest sacristy for 10 to 15 minutes after the altar servers completed their bows to the crucifix. To conclude, I should point out, the prosecutor, because most of the witnesses to be called by the prosecution would have been people connected with the church, those who are the MC and the director of the choir and the sacristan, the prosecution was given permission by the judge to cross-examine those witnesses if he thought they were being dishonest. And none of them was so cross-examined. So they gave their evidence, it all stacked up, and there's just no way that it could have happened. No way that it could have happened, but the DPP went all the way to the High Court inventing theories as to how it could have happened. And the 2 most senior judges in Victoria, having the benefit of the dissenting judgment of Justice Weinberg, the undisputed leading criminal law judge in the country, wrote 200 pages, having been called by the Chief Justice out of retirement to sit because he was the undisputed leader of the criminal section of the Victorian Supreme Court. There they were. They had the benefit of Weinberg's 200 pages and the benefit of submissions from Brett Walker, one of the leading counsel in the country, and Maxwell and Ferguson set their course and said no, and they wrote that nonsensical couple of sentences that I've just quoted to you. So that's why I say thank God for the High Court of Australia, and be in no mistake, I, originally a Queenslander, I admit I'm prejudiced, but I now live here in Victoria. I do boldly claim I don't think there's another police force in the country that would have done what this mob did to Pell. I don't think there's another DPP in the country who would have done before the High Court what Judd did to Pell. And I don't think there are 2 other judges on an ultimate court of appeal in Australia who would have done what was done by Ferguson and Maxwell. So that's why I'm delighted to be in Victoria, once and only to give you the benefit of my views as to why I think what it was a sting operation from go to woe, and thankfully the High Court has put it right. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Father Brennan. Do we have any questions? Neil, at the back.
What's his father Brennan's thought on the Louise Milligan book?
Oh, look, I read a bit of fiction, but not a lot. She wasn't at the trial, and the book doesn't cover it, of course. The book was written before the trial.
Where is she coming from?
Well, I don't know, you'd have to ask her. Let me just unpack the one part of her book that deals with what was alleged ultimately in these proceedings. She says that she goes along and visits, well, first of all, she did meet the complainant, who said to her, I want nothing to do with you, and I do not want you reporting any of this, but after it's all over, I'll be happy to talk to you. She completely disregards that and goes ahead and reports. The only other person to whom she has access is the mother of the other boy who was deceased. And the mother of the other boy basically says, look, Jay, the complainant, came to see me after my son's death and told me that, yes, they used to play around in the back rooms of the cathedral after choir practice, and that Pell came in and locked the doors and then had his way with them, and then that he remembered being taken home by his parents. Well, then comes the second edition of her book after the trial, and it gets reported then that, oh no, the door wasn't locked, it was only blocked. So was the mother originally mistaken? Has she corrected the mother, or is she just correcting it according to what she then saw in the evidence? And then omits all reference to Jay saying he was taken home by his parents, but that he can still vividly recall being in the car that day, but didn't know whether it was the woman to whom she was speaking or his own parents. So that's all you've got from Milligan in terms of substance of these proceedings. And as you can see, there's nothing there in Milligan's account.
Father Frank, Neil, what would the chances of a malicious prosecution action by Cardinal Pell be? What were the chances of getting up if he were able to go down that path? Which I doubt he would.
Well, I'm sure he wouldn't, and I don't know what the chances would be. As you've heard from what I've said, I think both with Victoria Police and the DPP, there was at the very least a lot of incompetence. Now, what mixture there was of incompetence and malice or adverse motivation, I don't know. And it's only if there'd ever be an inquiry that we would know. But the only way you'd ever have an inquiry would be if it was set up in Victoria. You're not going to have a federal inquiry into anything of this sort. And as you know, there's no interest among any of the politicians in Victoria of any political ilk in having inquiries. It's just that this is all just water under the bridge and it's time we all moved on. But it was, if not a malicious prosecution, it was a highly incompetent prosecution. I mean, I've said nothing to you about the fifth charge, which is truly, truly perverse. The fifth charge suggested that sometime later, and because they had Connor's diary, originally the complainant said that about a month after the first incident in the same choral year that this next incident occurred, but it then turned out the first incident had to be the 15th or the 22nd of December, and so the next time Pell was in the cathedral was the 23rd of February the next year, where Pell, as they say, was presiding, and the priest who said the Mass was a fellow Brendan Egan. And Brendan had since left the priesthood, but all during these proceedings he was working for a local council here in Victoria. But it was said with the second incident, that Pell had been presiding, was immediately behind Egan, and that Pell, in this dogleg corridor where you go up there and then to the left. So there are 3 links in the corridor. So you've got about 70 or 80 people processing in the corridor, altar servers, choir, other altar servers, Brendan, Egan, Pell. So it's said that Pell breaks from the back of the pack, comes up through the procession, finds Jay, puts him against the wall and assaults him sexually and then returns. Now, at the trial, let's be accurate here, at the trial, Richter's asking, read about this. That Archbishop Pell is supposed to push Mr. J into the wall and grab his private parts and squeeze them hard. You'd want to speak to Father Brendan Egan, wouldn't you? Father Egan hasn't been spoken to. Why? I don't have an answer for that because I haven't spoken to him. You see, because you'd want to know from Father Egan whether he went back in procession with Archbishop Pell who'd been presiding. You'd want to know that, wouldn't you? Yes, that would be reasonable, yes. You'd want to know whether they disrobed together in the sacristy. Yes, that would be reasonable. Okay, so no inquiries have been made in relation to February of 1997 at all that relate to this allegation? No, not in relation to Father Egan, they haven't, no. No. But in relation to anything that would provide any evidence about the alleged episode. No investigations undertaken by me, no. The evidence that's been given is the only material. Thank you, and when you say not by me, you are the leader of the team, and interpose contains all the activities of the team. No, it doesn't, I didn't say that. Well, is there any record of anyone undertaking any investigation about Jay's allegations relating to February 1997? No, not that I can categorically recall, no. Well, not that you recall at all. Not that I can recall, no. Right, and if there had been, you'd have known about it. Yes, you would. Yes, thank you. Not a single person was spoken to by the police before that charge was made and signed off on by the DPP. And all the way to the High Court saying, yep, you can believe the complainant on that one. It's farcical, just farcical.
Do you think there's a possibility that Jay had some beef against the Catholic Church or whatever, not specific to any allegation against Pell, and that he ventured into all this with the presumption that it would fail, but just to raise issues and perhaps discredit the Church of Pell?
Yeah. Look, I can't get too much inside the mind of Jay, but I'll say a couple of things. One is, we do know from what he said that he did suffer some mild abuse by a babysitter, when he was a kid at home. We also know that he claims to have been abused by his parish priest when he was a young altar server. So my own hunch is there's probably some of that at play, and transposing it, to the bigger picture, the cathedral and Cardinal Pell and all the rest. Those of us who attended the proceedings, or even any of you who are in the Court of Appeal when Mr. Boyce for the Crown mistakenly said his name, so a lot of us do know his name, and those of us who do know his name, if we want to, we can follow him on Twitter and on the web. He's got his own website and he puts up tweets every day. He's having a field day at the moment because he's very interested in politics and international security, and he's down on Morrison, he's down on the ALP, he's down on the Murdoch Press, he's down on the 9 newspapers, he's down on every form of media except that which is truly independent, etc. So he's a fellow who's he thinks and writes a lot, and I think he's got a very bold imagination. So my own hunch, I may be wrong, but my own hunch is that yes, there was abuse early in his life, and some of it related to a Catholic priest, and I think it's probably been transposed to, the top, Cardinal Pell in the top institutions, St Patrick's Cathedral, and that, he had a facility. I mean, he obviously convinced the jury. Just look at, changing this story as often as he did, where in the end he tripped over his own story. You can see it's just not possible to find 6 minutes once you've stepped out 408 steps in 5.5 minutes.
The money that came from the Vatican, supposedly, allegedly. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or whether there was any?
I do. I'm very wary about all this talk about Vatican money. You'll have picked up enough from me. I don't think Vic Pol needed Vatican money to be motivated or to have the resources to do any of this. They had all the resources in the world to investigate Pell and to do what they wanted to do. Now, with the Vatican money, I have no doubt that there's all sorts of seedy stuff with the administration of Vatican finances, and that Cardinal Pell was seen to be a bit of a boffer boy who'd come in from the Anglo world to clean it up, and that there's been lots of animosity about that. And yes, clearly there have been significant sums of money sent to Australia, but as I understand it, it was sent to a company called New Star, which was a company set up to, do stuff with these domain names and all the rest of it. So I continue to say, unless there's any real evidence, I wouldn't feed the speculation.
Cardinal Pell let all the lawyers do the talking for him. Do you think it would have been good that he actually got up himself and spoke?
Yeah, well, I mean, to give him his due, and I can disclose this because he mentions it in the first volume of his prison journal. After the first trial, when he didn't give evidence, I actually wrote to him at some length, and I went to Sydney and I had a long session with him to convince him that he should give evidence. Because basically, criminal lawyers take the view you shouldn't give evidence. Whereas it seemed to me that things had reached the stage, no matter how perverse the facts might be, I thought that juries were sick to death of senior church officials with resources, having good lawyers to cross-examine complainants at great length while they just sat there silent. I thought that he should give evidence. And when it came to the second trial, I thought he was going to give evidence. And in fact, when I could see that Rector had turned things up a notch or two, I thought, oh, that's right, because this time Pell's going to give evidence, and he didn't. Now, it's very easy, given the way things go, to then say, oh, well, I was right and Rector was wrong, but I wouldn't do that at all, because I would imagine, I don't know, but I imagine a lawyer of the competence of Rector would have looked at all this and said, well, look, there's no jury that, which is exactly what the 7 High Court judges said, there's no jury that could convict on this because there's just not the evidence. But I think that probably there would have been a significant number of jurors who thought, after everything that's gone on with the Catholic Church, even if he didn't do it, he should take one for the team, and he wasn't going to get up there and give evidence, so we'll slot him. I suspect some of that would have been at play. Yeah, and then we'll come back to the
Should Judd, Maxwell and Ferguson have resigned after that debacle?
Oh, well, that's a matter for their determination. I mean, it was a very poor judgment, and, I dare say for them, a very humiliating put down by the High Court, as it was for Judd. In fact, go and have a look at the High Court judgment. As lawyers in the know, Judd, when she was drowning towards the end of her submissions to the High Court, she finally, as only a Victorian could, had the audacity to put to the High Court, oh, well, look, if you're minded to think that we haven't quite got this right, shouldn't you send it back to the Victorian Court of Appeal? And the High Court, 7-0, they quoted the submission and said, this is specious. Now, I had never seen that in a High Court judgment before, and I know enough about how the High Court works to know that that draft judgment sat on 7 desks, and every one of them would have come to that word specious and gone, ooh, we don't normally use a word like that. And this isn't just a QC appearing for the DPP, this is the DPP in person. They said, no, specious. So, look, not the finest hour of jurisprudence in Victoria. Now, you may have said, I mean, Justice Maxwell is retiring a bit early. He's going, I think, in the next month or two. But I think to acknowledge very clearly the signal contribution of Justice Weinberg, and that if ever there was a dissenting judgment which is just not only reeking of judicial accuracy, but also integrity in the face of, you know, all the public carry-on and of his 2 judicial seniors, that he stood firm on the evidence and on the law and said, this just doesn't cut it. 1, 2 and 3. Yep.
Father Brennan, you pointed out when Cardinal Pell was interviewed to go back to Melbourne and talk to the concelebrants and officers and so on. I've never yet heard anyone say, were there any concelebrants at the first Mass, and were they? Because that's never been brought to public.
It's, I mean, I don't know, and I haven't heard anyone who does know. See, this is the trouble, and that's why I think it's so important to learn the lessons from this case. See, what are we looking at? We're looking at allegations of things that occurred at an incident 22 years before. Now, can you remember who was there 22 years ago? And let's face it, if the allegation were not that Pell had done something after a solemn high mass where you had Connor's diary where you could identify it as the 15th of December, you know, after the 11 a.m. mass in 1996. If it were just a generic thing, in a back room in the cathedral sometime 22 years ago, that's why it's so necessary to have good, competent policing, and policing that you can trust. Whereas with this case, you have to say you wouldn't trust the police from here to the door when it came to the investigation of this particular Catholic cleric, and you wouldn't have faith in their policing techniques. And in fact, one of the things I've been strong on is that I think there's a need, when you've got outfits now like this Sarno task force that was set up, I don't think they were actually doing policing. They weren't collecting evidence. They were basically collecting mud. Now, it's one thing to collect mud, but if you're going to prosecute, you've got to have evidence, and that's what's essential. Now, there was, sorry?
Robert Ridley, when he submitted the... When Robert Ridley submitted got an appeal, why wasn't Archbishop Pell not sent to prison straight away? I mean, other cases, they don't go to prison straight away. They don't go to prison straight away. Why in his case?
He was on compassionate grounds. He wasn't sent to jail straight away because he very desperately needed knee replacements. Yeah. So he went for the surgery, and then he was available for.
So he could he have stayed out of jail until the appeal?
Oh, sorry. Well, I think they looked at that. I mean, there probably was an argument to put to a court to say that he should be released on bail, but it wasn't a sure thing, and given the public pandemonium that was out there, I think it was thought it's sensible not to attend that.
You've mentioned juries a couple of times. There are rumours floating around in legal circles, and I'm sure you've heard them, about leaks coming from the jury.
No, I haven't.
Okay, all right. There are, but anyway. And so much of this is pretty obvious, even to people like myself. But our much vaunted praise of the jury system as being the best in the world, it would seem that people can be influenced on a jury by one or two bullies who are determined to get their own way. Any comment?
Question about whether or not there could be one or two people who'd be bullies on juries getting their own way. I have no doubt that's the case. I mean, I have great faith in the jury system, but that's why you need the appellate system there. And if you look carefully at the High Court judgment, which is consistent with the jurisprudence that's been developed over the years, it's that it's not for the appeal court to put itself in the place of the jury, but it is for the appeal court to say, could a jury convict on this evidence beyond reasonable doubt? And basically what the High Court said in this case is, no jury doing its job could convict on this evidence beyond reasonable doubt.
So I rest my case.
Yeah. One.
I'd imagine if there was a concerted effort to find a conviction and have it done there, one of the tactics would be to leave the other party funds to fund their defence. Was George Pell tested in having funds to stay the course throughout his appeal process?
Oh, well, I mean, clearly he had to rely on friends not only in Australia but overseas in order to be able to fund the defence. And as I understand it, that in part is why the publication of his 3-volume prison journal, to help repay some of those expenses that he undertook.
Was he always assured of being able to fund it, or was it
Oh no, he wouldn't have been assured that at all. No, and particularly having to have a second trial was a great expense.
I'm concerned about the contempt of court with the media from start to finish with this case, and especially the day before the trial, the ABC, the public broadcaster, from dawn to dusk, right through to the Four Corners, and then after, they kept reporting all this stuff when it was clearly, and there was no action taken on that. They were just allowed to go ad lib, and that clearly, I didn't know what the DPP was doing about that, and how can that be avoided again? Because that clearly worsened everything, you know?
Well, I think this case highlights there are some issues about the ABC which are not just restricted to this.
But could the DPP have any powers with this contempt of what was happening? Could they stop it? Did they fail to carry out their duty again?
No, because the ABC is always careful with their lawyers to make sure they've legaled it all. Yeah. So, for example, you know, that egregious program that Sarah Ferguson put to air just before, that sort of thing, they know they can get away with it, even though it's completely unprofessional.
Oh, shocking.
1, 2,
2022, in your opinion, is the big pole on the one hand, or chain pattern on the other hand, have a bias or an issue with the Catholic Church?
Have a
bias?
Have a bias against the Catholic Church?
Yeah.
Oh, look, I don't know. I think it's broader than that with Vic Pol. I mean, have a look at what happened recently with the Lawyer X Royal Commission. Now, as I said, you know, the High Court said that the behaviour of Vic Pol was reprehensible in relation to Lawyer X. There was then a Royal Commission with a judge from Queensland, came down, did the inquiry, made findings which were adverse to quite a number of individuals, including a gentleman, Finn McRae, who was the main lawyer for Vic Pol. And in fact, out here, on the 10th of March, Shane Patton put out a press release saying, oh, guess what, our lawyer is being completely cleared by the Victorian Legal Services Board and Commissioner. He said, it doesn't come as a surprise to me at all. It's great that he's been publicly vindicated. Now, I've looked for trying to find where's the public vindication. Can't find anything on the Victorian Legal Service Board website. All we have is the hearsay statement of the Police Commissioner to say our man's in the clear, when the Royal Commission clearly said that our man was not in the clear. So there are issues much broader than just, bias against the Catholic Church.
Red shirts, Michael, keep going.
Now there was, yeah.
What is Cardinal Pell doing now?
Oh, well, I mean, I'm not up to date with all his doings, but he's basically in Rome now. He's over 80, so he's not eligible to vote in a conclave. But, he's a key player still in Rome, I think. And also, at the moment, you may be aware, there are legal proceedings underway, Vatican legal proceedings, against Cardinal Pell and others about the wrongful spending of funds. And it's no secret that there was quite a degree of tension between Cardinal Pell and Cardinal Pell. And Cardinal Pell himself, even on the weekend, issued a statement questioning the extent to which Pell had actually answered the allegations against him in the proceedings. So I imagine he's sitting around waiting to be called to give evidence in those proceedings in an attempt to try and clean up the Vatican finances. What else he's up to, I don't know. I do know that he travels, I think, a fair bit to the UK and to the United States and gets invited to give various talks and things like that. And he's definitely been quite outspoken recently against some of the German bishops, and Cardinal Hollerich, another Jesuit, who's Cardinal Pell thinks has been expressing far too small L liberal views on matters to do with sexuality, etc. So he's still out there, proclaiming the tradition as he sees it.
I was just wondering if you had any comments to make about the Premier at the moment. He was quite high in this matter, and he came out very critical of the High Court after its decision, which wasn't very appropriate. So do you have any ideas what role he played?
No, but I thought his remark after the High Court decision was very unfortunate. I think it's important for elected leaders in our democracy to show respect for the rule of law and to show respect for the ultimate courts of appeal. And I think on that occasion he could have done better.
Why did the police, you explained what's happened, it's very good, Frank, but why did they go to so much trouble? Why was it, what did they have? Were they smarting from various bad, there's been some pretty ordinary reports made about the original Victorian, was the Royal Commission, but they got lambasted a bit in that for not pursuing a criminal case against a certain priest who is now dead. And was it a revenge? And how did the judges get it so long? Aren't they supposed to be independent of what the police think?
Well, the police, I think there must have been at least some police who were just convinced that Pell was a pedophile, just they couldn't get the evidence. And they tried everything. Operation Tethering, front page of The Age, Christmas Eve 2015, the Eureka Pool allegations up at Ballarat, that they fell apart. And so I think they just in the end became desperate that their mindset just wasn't delivering for them, and so they dug themselves firmly into a hole. As for the judiciary, I don't know. I fear it was the two most senior judges of the state being too sensitive to the groupthink of the community. Now that's a very critical thing to say, but I say it in view of the fact that they knew the competence of Weinberg, they had his judgment, and they knew the competence of Walker, and they had his submissions. And you might remember, before the Victorian Court of Appeal, Boyce, who appeared for the DPP in that, you know, a lot of the media were very critical of him because he seemed to be rather dumbstruck. Well, I thought at the time he seemed to be, you know, a decent prosecutor appellate counsel who basically said, well, all I have in my brief is to say, just look at the video and see how credible he is. As for all this other stuff, we don't know. The jury accepted that he was credible. Now that was as high as it could be put, but that was high enough to get Ferguson and Maxwell on board.
But the complaint didn't appear at the second trial, I believe. They showed the
No, what they did was just replay the video of his evidence at the first trial.
But how can you get a really feeling of what's going on to a jury?
Yeah.
It's like watching football on
Oh,
TV.
And I think it's a valid concern. I mean, ever tried sitting down watching a 2-day video?
Yeah. It's right, like he wasn't a child when the trials were on, he was an adult.
Oh yeah, sure. It was 33
Why are they
years
giving
ago.
that extra protection?
Well, no, I've got sympathy for those laws that have been put in place.
Yeah.
You know, for people who have suffered abuse, that they enjoy anonymity, and that they not be there, you know, confronted by the person that they allege has done dreadful things to them as a child and all of that. Now, I'm not sufficiently expert to know whether the pendulum's gone a bit too far, but I think that basically the principles behind that sort of legislation are right. Yeah.
Father Frank, could I jump in with a question? Then we might have time for one or two more.
Yeah.
My understanding is, you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but prior to Pell's trial, at some point there was a change to the policy of either the Victoria Police or the Victorian Prosecutor's Office in how they would regard abuse complaints, which in past times, you know, may have struggled to progress because of a he said, she said dilemma. So they said we've got to change this somehow to make it a little bit easier. And I remember reading that some people felt possibly they've made it too easy. Possibly they've tipped the scales a little bit too far. Can you clarify what those changes were and whether perhaps that needs to be looked at?
I don't know the full details of the changes, but basically they are in accord with what you've said. Whether or not they've gone too far, my point is that's why you need good policing. And so if you're going to have an outfit like Sano, which works with those new principles, I think there's a need within the police force for an overseeing policing unit to make sure that proper investigation has been done and that the evidence is there. And I think that the DPP also has to play its role in not proceeding with cases that couldn't possibly result in a conviction.
Maybe two more questions.
One here and one.
This whole thing was a farce, but what if the other scenario was High Court didn't quash it, then he stayed in jail? On reflection, has the Cardinal Pell turned around and said, I was prepared to be a modern-day martyr of the Victorian Labor government, or because there was other cases, the other allegations raised against him. You mentioned about the pool in Ballarat. That was more maybe believable than this. Like, you know.
I think the DPP originally thought the Ballarat allegations were more believable than this because they wanted to proceed with that case first. And people often forget it was actually Pell's counsel who said that no, this case should be heard first because they were the more serious offences and there were witnesses who were elderly and it would prejudice proceedings if they were delayed too long. So I suspect that, you know, in hindsight, you know, everyone's saying, oh, well, yeah, this was the case to get him. I don't think the police necessarily did think that in the first instance. Now, Pell himself, I think there was a time, I mean, he was gutted by the findings by Maxwell and Ferguson. And I think there was a time when he thought, well, is there any point in appealing further? Because these judges, you just can't trust them. But I think he was convinced by his own people that no, the High Court was a very different proposition from the Victorian Court of Appeal. See, another thing worth remembering, and have a look at some of the letters he's written. A fellow by the name of Silbert, who was quite senior in the DPP, and he wrote a very long article in the Australian Law Journal 2 years ago, pointing out that the Victorian Court of Appeal, when it was first established, was a very respected court, and was hardly ever overruled by the High Court. But in recent years, he points out in criminal matters it had been overruled 16 times. That's a lot of times. So you're dealing with a court that's had its problems. I should say, though, that, I mean, I personally know quite a number of the Victorian Supreme Court, and there are some truly outstanding judges on the Victorian Supreme Court. But you've heard enough from me to know that there are a couple I wouldn't include in that list.
Yes, I think just on the Ellis case, where Pell argued that the Catholic Church cannot be prosecuted because it's not an entity. Is that case still operative in the Catholic Church now,
No.
or they're restricted from that?
But legislation has dealt with all of that, and there's always someone to sue. And I think where there was some media misrepresentation in relation to Ellis, etc., is that Ellis himself had received considerable assistance from the Archdiocese of Sydney. So even though in the early stages there was the pleading of those sorts of defences, that was not the situation later in the case. But now all of that has been dealt with satisfactorily by legislation which ensures there's always someone to sue, and you can always reopen proceedings from the past, and those sorts of arrangements, I think, are appropriate.
Could you please tell us about your new book?
What's that?
Could you please tell us about your new book?
This is, I put out a book just called Observations on the Pell Proceedings, and all it is, it's everything I've said publicly about the matter, from the first interview that I gave the day after there was the lifting of the suppression order. And I just thought it was necessary to put out publicly everything I'd said so that people could make their own assessment of it, and if people thought I'd got anything wrong, they could tell me. And I haven't heard from anyone yet as to any material errors that are here in anything that I said. Even though early in the piece, after I did my first interview on ABC 7:30, etc., in February 2019, people said all sorts of egregious things about me. But I think maybe the tide is starting to turn.
Can we give a round of applause to... Well, Father Brennan mentioned during his talk that Cardinal Pell asked him to do this, service to himself, I guess, and in some way to the church, I think, of observing the proceedings and then trying to explain to people. And he mentioned that Cardinal Pell thought that would go over well with the literati and glitterati. I can't imagine that sticking up for Cardinal Pell would have won you too many popularity contests amongst the literati and glitterati. I don't know what sort of...
certainly didn't.
I don't know what sort of price that you may have paid for that. I hope it hasn't cost you too many friends, but I just want to thank you on behalf of the Church in Australia. I feel like you've done us all a service by your work. not to mention the service to the justice system, in your honesty and boldness in calling out the errors. We all want to live in a place where we can trust the justice system and respect it. But in order for that to happen, mistakes have to be acknowledged and errors corrected. And so I thank you for your boldness in speaking out about that. We have a small gift. A small gift of thanks.
Thank you.
And there'll also be a bucket going around. If anyone would like to make a donation, the bucket will be coming around, and that'll help us to just give Father Brennan another thank you for his time tonight. He's given a lot of his time in writing his book, in observing the proceedings, and in coming here tonight. So we'd like to thank him. If the bucket comes around, if you can be generous, we'd be grateful. A few quick announcements. So, God and Beer, we've got our next event coming up in June. And whereas usually we're on a Monday night, the Monday night we would have held the June event, it happens to be on the Queen's birthday. So we've moved it to the following day, which is Tuesday the 14th of June. Hopefully you can all read up on the screen there. We'll have Dr. Andy Mullins speaking about how to pass the faith on to your family. The Catholic faith's been passed down for 2,000 years successfully, but right now it seems like a real challenge to do that. I know I've got 4 children, and I think a lot, and I worry a lot about how I can pass the faith on, because it seems to be a very difficult thing. So this talk will, I hope, help anyone who'd like to help pass the faith on to their children, on to their grandchildren, nieces, nephews, family members, what have you. I think this will be really helpful for anyone in that situation, which I think is everyone in the room. The Knights of the Southern Cross, who are responsible for putting this event on, we've got a priest support and education dinner coming up in August, and if you'd like to come along to that, it's open to the public. You just need to talk to someone at our table outside the door there, and you can find out more about that event. It's a really wonderful event. A couple of hundred people come along every year, and it's just a way that we can support the priests and seminarians of the Archdiocese of Melbourne. The Knights of the Southern Cross also running a book fair in June at Nazareth College, and if you'd like to support that, we'd be very grateful. One great way you can support it is if you've got any books that you'd like to donate. Books, DVDs, games, board games, records, anything like that. There's information on the table out there. You can grab a flyer. If you'd really like to be generous and take a flyer to put up in your parish, that would be amazing. Thank you. The Central Catholic Bookshop has been kind enough to come along tonight with Father Brennan's book, and also there's 2 other books that have been written about the whole Pell saga by Gerard Henderson and
Keith Windshuttle,
thank you. And also Cardinal Pell's prison journals. All 3 volumes are available just outside there. You'll be able to have a look at those, and if you'd like to buy one, they're available. So thanks to the Catholic Bookshop for doing that. Finally, if you'd like to support God and Beer, as well as making a financial donation that's coming around, and by the way, last month a few people wanted to donate but didn't have any cash. They wanted to donate with FPOS. We have that facility tonight available just at our table out there, so feel free to ask about that. Another great way you could support us is by grabbing some flyers from our table outside there. We've got these flyers and posters, which you can take back to your parish and put up on the notice board or on in your parish foyer, obviously with the permission of your parish priest, if you can check with that first. So we'd be very grateful if you could support this event. We'd love to grow it and get more people to come along. I know you might think, how can we fit more people in here? But normally we will be in the stake room, which those who were here last month would remember was next door. It's a much larger room. We can fit a lot more people in. Unfortunately tonight that was taken before we could get it. So that's why we're in here tonight. I hope it hasn't been too difficult for the claustrophobic among us. Finally, we have a Facebook page, and it would be a great help to us if you could join our Facebook page, like our Facebook page. So look for us on Facebook.
The videos will be up.
Thanks to Andrew Vaccaro. If you can give him a hand for all the great work he does on the videos. A video of Father Brennan's talk will be available in the next few days. It'll be on YouTube, so you can watch it
and
again or share it with your friends, and on Facebook. And I'll send out a link to that video to everyone who's registered for tonight or who's on our email list. If that's not you, if you haven't registered, that's fine, that's no problem. You might just want to chuck your email address down on the sheet outside the door on the table. So thanks so much to everyone for coming. Thanks so much again to Father Brennan for his time tonight and for sharing his knowledge with us. And yeah, I think it'll probably be great if a few people can make their way outside just to clear the room a little bit, because it's pretty packed at the moment. So yeah, feel free to enjoy a drink, stick around and have a chat. Thanks so much for coming, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.